Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, I've got a lot of information I want to try and get through tonight about what's happening as a result of the Moore Supreme Court decision last June and other decisions that have an impact on the IRS and what's been happening in the courts. But let's go through the preliminaries here. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating and the shows coming. So, if you like the information, the shows, the discussions, the topics, the hosts and the guests on the other shows on the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to libertyworksradionetwork.com website, if you're not there listening now online already, and get yourself signed up as a subscribing member, even if it's as little as $10, $15, $20 a month. Every membership helps, and we do need your support to keep the network operating and the broadcast coming. So, and if you want to get educated and fully informed on what's happening with the IRS, the DOJ, and the federal courts regarding their unconstitutional enforcement of the federal income tax for the last 75 years, actually since 1955, guess that's 70 years, huh? You need to find your way over to www.taxfreedom.com and start reading. And if you know anyone that needs help with the IRS, including with the tax court or the federal district court with the DOJ, either civilly or criminally, you send them over to irszoom.com, tell them to give me a call. We'll get things straightened out. So, at taxfreedom.com and irszoom.com to get educated and get help with dealing with the IRS administratively and the DOJ in court, using the document templates we have for addressing the lack of subject matter jurisdiction to enforce a direct tax under the 16th Amendment, which is what the IRS irrefutably has been doing for over 50 years, and which the DOJ has irrefutably been arguing in the court. The 16th Amendment authorizes a non-apportioned direct income tax on the income of all persons. In other words, they argue the 16th Amendment got rid of the concept of limited powers of taxation. It unleashed the government to tax all persons directly and without apportionment on any basis they wanted. And of course, they've been doing that on a non-uniform basis because of the graduated tax brackets, which doesn't treat citizens uniformly. It treats them as though they were parts of different classes of persons, which are prohibited under the 14th and 15th Amendments. The whole thing's been unconstitutional. Graduated taxation was legitimate in the 1880s when they were able to discriminate and use tax brackets with corporations concerning the commodities and articles of commerce taxed. The corporations and the commodities are inanimate and can be discriminated against on the basis of how much money is earned through the enjoyment of the privilege enjoyed. A corporation making $1 million can be taxed at a higher rate than one making $10,000. But you can't lay that graduated class system on top of the citizens. That's unconstitutional. Citizens have to be treated uniformly. You can't have one law for the Jews and the Muslims and another law for the Christians. You can't have one tax rate for blacks and another for whites, or one tax rate for the men and the other for the women, or the young or the old, or the gay or the straight. You can't have different laws for different classes of persons. You can't discriminate against the citizens on any basis. And that includes earning money, having wealth, having property, being productive, and yes, even earning income. That's kind of why they need you to voluntarily adopt it. Because technically it's unconstitutional for them to enforce a non-uniform tax against the citizens. And the geographical uniformity argument falls apart as soon as you test it with the hypothetical tax arrangements I just threw out. What do you think? Think it would be okay to tax Jews at 95% and Christians at 5%? Or Muslims at 90% and Christians at 10%? And it would be fine as long as all the Jews and the Muslims in New York and California and Florida were treated the same in each state? Well, that's what geographical uniformity opens the door to. As long as you treat them all the same, it's okay to discriminate on any basis you want, including wealth or income. No, baloney. That's communism, literally the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. It's not authorized, it's unconstitutional, it has been right from the beginning. So, why don't we get into this? I've been talking about how the Moore decision last June opens the door to this. And there's a whole bunch of repercussions that immediately occur as a result of the Supreme Court ruling that income taxes are indirect taxes, not a direct tax under the 16th Amendment, but indirect taxes under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and that all direct taxes must be apportioned to the states under the census. That means if the income tax is a direct tax like they've been enforcing it, it's been unconstitutionally enforced against the citizens for 70 years. But it's not direct, it's indirect. And that means there's no basis for the taxation of labor or earning money or income in the 50 states, because impost, duty, and excise don't tax labor or earning money generically in the 50 states. They only tax imports, exports, foreign persons, foreign activity in foreign places, commodities, licenses, and corporations. Labor isn't taxed. Interest, dividends, alimony, commissions, annuities, tips, none of it is taxed by impost, duty, or excise, which requires, according to the Supreme Court in Moore, that you participate in a federally taxable activity or transaction subject to some impost on foreign activity, a duty on exported goods, or an excise on commodities, license, or corporations. Now, which one of those, foreign, export, commodities, license, or corporations, are you deriving your earnings from every month at your work? There isn't a basis to tax indirectly labor of American citizens in the 50 states. That's why they've had to lie since 1955, claiming the basis was the 16th Amendment and a new authority to tax directly, because that was the only way the federal government could argue they had a power to tax your labor, your interest, your rent, your dividends, everything earned within the territories of the 50 states exclusively by right to own, possess, and accumulate property without federal interference or federal taxation of the activities occurring exclusively within the 50 states. If they want to tax the corporations paying of dividends, they can do that, but they can't tax the recipient of the dividend unless they're foreign or corporate or licensed. So, the Moore decision immediately opens the door to opposing in every single court in the country, tax court, district court, appellate court, Supreme Court, the argument that it's a non-apportioned direct tax, which basically destroys the government's claim that they've made an assessment, because they assessed a direct tax, which doesn't exist, and they assessed it on a direct basis, which doesn't exist as a constitutional basis for the taxation of the people indirectly. And they can't be taxed directly because direct taxes have to be apportioned to the states for payment, not the people. So either way, their claim fails. Moore says it's indirect, it's not direct, and that alone is sufficient to destroy every single claim the IRS is making for tax today, currently in process, in every single state in the country. It's defeated, it's done. All you can do is argue it. So the first premise, it's a non-apportioned direct tax, is a lie. It's a straight up open fraud that everybody can read for themselves in the Moore decision on pages 5 to 7 of the opinion. So the tax is not a direct tax. And as I said, that opens the door to the second issue, which is where the Supreme Court says income taxes are indirect taxes under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. They even go so far as to identify that the 16th Amendment is part of that indirect foundation. It's not an authority to tax directly and without limitation. It's part of the indirect authority to tax by impost, duty, and excise. All it does is limit the source argument. But that doesn't mean that all sources of citizens suddenly become taxable. That leaves out the impost, duty, and excise part of it, because the Supreme Court says the 16th Amendment created no new powers and no new subjects. Citizens weren't subjects before the amendment, they're not subjects afterwards. No new powers means it can't be a new power to tax directly and without limitation or without apportionment, which is what they've been doing for 70 years. But it also means it can't be a new power to tax indirectly as a fourth kind of indirect taxation beyond impost, duty, and excise. Now you're going to add income too? No, it's impost, duty, and excise measured by income. Income is the yardstick of that measures the amount of tax owed from the activities or transactions conducted subject to an impost, duty, or excise. And income is the yardstick that measures the amount of tax owed on all the earnings derived after expenses. Income's not the object of the tax or the subject of taxation. It's the mechanism that measures the amount of the impost, duty, or excise. But if there is no impost on foreign activity, no duty on exported goods, no excise on the manufacture, consumption, or sale of commodities, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, or licenses, no license, no corporate activity, where's the basis for the indirect tax? There isn't one. There isn't one. There is no taxation of the labor or the earnings or the activities of the American people in the 50 states. It was only possible to argue that through the application of the income tax as a direct tax. So we can positively establish it's not a direct tax, and what they've been doing for 70 years is a fraud. We can positively establish that it's an indirect tax, and as an indirect tax, there is no taxation of the American people's labor. The only way you could argue that indirect taxation reaches the American people's labor is you could argue labor is a commodity. And therefore, it can be taxed because excise powers tax commodities. And if labor is a commodity, well, then you can tax the labor of the American people and call it an excise. Unfortunately, the labor unions saw this coming in the mid-30s when they put Social Security in place. They recognized that there's no direct taxation allowed, regardless of the 16th Amendment, and this is in the mid-30s, and they knew that there was no way to tax labor imposed by indirectly under Article 1, Section 8 by impost, duty, or excise, unless you were allowed to argue labor is a commodity. So they passed Title 15, Section 17, which says the labor of a human being is not a commodity or article of commerce. And that means your labor can't be taxed as a commodity as an excise under Article 1, Section 8. There's no way to get there. It's prohibited by law. So, okay, I think they're going to be coming up on the commercial break here in a moment. The third issue that's opened up by the recent Moore decision, of course, is the subject matter jurisdiction of the federal courts to do anything with the assessments or deficiencies that are being demanded. So we're going to get into that when we get back. I do hear the commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour. And again, I want to urge you, get signed up over at the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website, become a subscribing member, and keep listening for more information about the death of the income tax, because it's dying, people, both federally and state. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and I'm just going to get right back into this. As the commercial break came up, I was saying that the income tax is dying. It's already dead, actually. People just haven't found out what the Supreme Court said, and those that have found out are denying what it means, because they understand it means everything falls. The federal tax and all the state income taxes fall as well, because almost every single state has hinged its state income tax on the federal income tax. And if it turns out the federal income tax isn't a direct tax on everything that happens in the state, well, then nobody will owe any federal income tax and have no filing requirement. And that means there's no filing requirement or tax owed in the state, because they've all based the state tax on the federal filing requirement and gross income or adjusted gross income under Section 61 and Section 62 in the federal code. And as I've explained, Section 61 is the Canadian tax treaty that expired in 1993. It's not domestic law. And Section 62 is European tax treaties. It's not domestic law. The federal government has no authority to tax your adjusted gross income because Congress used the words in a statute. Where's the impost, the duty, or the excise? It doesn't exist because they're forcing it as a direct tax, because they've left out the part about it was implemented under Section 61 in 1918 under a foreign tax treaty. So it's not a direct tax. There's no enabling enforcement clause that would apply to a direct tax being enforced against the people, which means the courts can't show there's any constitutionally authorized power to tax directly. And that means they can't enforce a single assessment or deficiency in any court anywhere in the country. Not the bankruptcy court, not the tax court, not the district court, not the appellate courts, the circuit courts, or the Supreme Court. Nobody has the authority anymore under Moore to enforce a direct, non-apportioned tax against individuals. It kills the federal tax. The fact that it's not direct, that it has been assessed as a direct, that they've been arguing it's direct for 60 years and fining people up to $40,000, $50,000 for having the correct arguments. It's not constitutionally authorized as a direct tax. It's only constitutionally authorized as an indirect impost, duty, or excise measured by income. No new powers, no new subjects, no taxation of labor. No tax imposed in Chapter 24 of Subtitle C. No liability for tax other than that in the name of the tax collectors, the withholding agents and the employers, thereby allowing the payers of the tax to shift the burden of it, making it a classically indirect tax that is collected and then paid by people who don't pay the tax out of their own pocket. They just turn over to the government what they collected from other persons. The same way a sales tax is indirectly collected and paid by stores. The same way the original income tax is indirectly collected and paid by the withholding agents, who are only allowed, authorized, and required to collect the tax from foreign persons. There was no collection of the income tax at the source. From 1913 to 1942, citizens didn't pay the tax. It wasn't imposed on them in the 50 states, and everybody knew it. It wasn't until World War II and the victory tax that they changed the psyche of the American worker to accept the direct taxation of the labor and the enslavement of their person at the expense of both their spiritual and physical well-being, as everyone is compelled to serve man instead of God. And that works on the mind that understands the problem. So issue 4 that comes up is, it's indirect. Where's the liability for the tax? Oh, it's in 1461 and 3403, the indirect liability. So where is the alleged liability for a direct tax? That doesn't exist in statute. That has been argued that it arises under the regulations for Section 1, the tax imposed. But Section 1 imposes a rate of tax on taxable income of different classes of persons: married, individual, heads of household. Who's liable, and how are you liable for a rate of tax? See, the statute doesn't make anyone liable because that would be direct taxation and unconstitutional and unauthorized if the statute that imposed the tax on all persons also made them liable for the payment of it as an unavoidable direct tax on labor and revenues. So they made it up. It's not in the statute. They know that. So they made it up. They wrote it into regulation, and now they argue you're liable for the direct tax under the 16th Amendment, the non-apportioned direct tax authorized by the 16th Amendment, allegedly. You're made liable by regulation. And the statute doesn't do that. And I'm sorry, but Chevron and regulatory deference is gone. The Supreme Court ruled in Loper-Bright that the courts can no longer defer to the agency's regulations and enforce them when those regulations go beyond the force of law imparted by the statute. The courts must look to the statutes first and not the regulations, and that means no one's liable because the regulation at 1.1 is no longer valid under Loper-Bright. The Chevron regulatory deference is gone. The statute doesn't support direct liability. The Supreme Court's ruling that it's an indirect tax doesn't support liability for tax imposed, a rate of tax on taxable income, which has itself inherent constitutional limitations of not taxing the people. Only the corporations, the foreigners, the imports, the exports in foreign places and foreign countries under tax treaties, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, other commodities. There's no taxation of labor. Nobody is liable. Loper-Bright destroys the alleged liability for tax. Why would you invent a liability under regulation when you clearly have liability in statutes to enforce? 1461 and 1463 in subtitle A, making the withholding agent the collector liable for everything is collected from foreign persons, and 3403, making the employer liable for the taxes he's withheld from his employees. Nowhere in any statute is the employee made liable for tax in subtitle C, or is the recipient of the taxable income made statutorily liable in subtitle A. Subtitle A, of course, being the body of law enacted in 1913 under the original Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913, which was the original income tax legislation. It's a tariff. A tariff is one form of an impost, which is one of the three indirect forms of taxation allowed by Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, which only tax foreign activity. Tariffs tax foreign activity. That's why it wasn't collected or paid by citizens from 1913 to 1942. And Section 61 wasn't even part of the original legislation. It wasn't adopted until 5 years later in 1918 under the Canadian Tax Treaty that lasted 75 years and expired in 1993 and was replaced by Bill Clinton with NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. No more taxation. That's been replaced with the MCA, Mexico, Canada, America Agreement. No taxation. Section 61 is dead letter law. It never applied as domestic legislation, and that's the error that the Supreme Court made in 1955 in Glenshaw Glass, just like the error they made in Roe v. Wade, just like the error they made in the affirmative action cases, just like the error they made in Chevron, just like the error they made in Dred Scott and Korematsu. The same court. They don't get it right all the time. But they've finally gotten it right in Moore, and they explain it, why, and how the limitations are still applicable to both direct taxation, all direct taxation, and uniformity applies to indirect taxation. They argue geographical uniformity. I've explained what's wrong with that. No, geographical uniformity doesn't work with citizens. It becomes class legislation that divides and destroys. So issue 5 is, if you're not liable, where is labor made subject to the tax? Because salaries and wages aren't listed in section 61, which is what they've been arguing as the sources. Salaries and wages aren't listed there. They're removed. The only salaries and wages actually subject to tax under the code are those of the non-resident alien under section 1441B. Salaries and wages used to be part of section 61 when it was section 22 and only applied to the tax treaty with Canada. But in 1954, they recodified the law and moved section 22 to section 54 and removed the words salaries and wages. And I believe this showed an intent by the socialist forces still controlling government at that point in time to ultimately begin using section 61 to enforce the tax against American citizens without actually having a statute that violated the Constitution by trying to tax the labor of the American people in the 50 states by taxing salaries and wages. Now, salaries, wages, and compensation were all taxable to citizens in Canada under Section 22. They removed salaries and wages and recodified it in 54, and 1 year later in 55, the Supreme Court says in Glensaw Glass, everything you make, all accessions to wealth, are taxable to the federal government as income under the 16th Amendment and Section 61. And they only had to wait a little while longer for some judge to decide that compensation was a form of salaries and wages was a form of compensation. And since compensation was in Section 61, then naturally everyone is now a slave of the federal government. They can tax your salaries and wages as well as compensation, none of which was ever taxable by impost, duty, or excise under Article 1, Section 8, when earned in the 50 states. Only allegedly taxable by virtue of the not apportioned direct tax under the 16th Amendment that they have been communistically jamming down the throats of the American people since 1955, when the liberal court went off the deep end and authorized the enforcement of the second plank of the Communist Manifesto as class legislation against the American people in place of indirect, uniform taxation by impost, duty, and excise. Only certain activities and transactions subject to tax. The labor of the American people are not subject to taxation other than through a direct tax, which has to be apportioned to the states. So you wouldn't pay it. It cannot be taxed indirectly under Article 1, Section 8, which is what the Supreme Court says the income tax is. They've got a problem, and it's all going to die. Because the Supreme Court isn't going to rewrite the constitutional foundations it reaffirmed and reasserted in Moore. At some point, the IRS, the DOJ, and the lower courts are going to hit a brick wall. And they're going 150 miles an hour right into it. And they're so blind they don't see it coming. It's going to be a bloody mess. Your labor is not subject to tax. They've been lying to you for 60 years. Okay, I hear the second commercial break coming up, so we'll be back in 5 minutes. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Please come on over to the website, get signed up, libertyworksradionetwork.com. Nothing else works, only Liberty works. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just go ahead and get right back into it. So when the commercial break came up, I was pointing out that in 1913, the Supreme Court said the tax is indirect, no new powers are created, no new subjects are created. And now again in 2024 and more, the Supreme Court says again, consistently, income taxes are indirect taxes, and that all direct taxes are still subject to the two limitations imposed by the Constitution of apportionment to the states for payment in proportion to the census, the last census, and the state's population under that census. So, direct taxes cannot be enforced by the federal courts against an individual person. And that's what they've been doing for 70 years. And indirect taxation by impost, duty, and excise doesn't tax the American people or their activities in the 50 states. The whole thing falls. The direct tax, the tax on labor, the tax based on gross income, the tax under the 16th Amendment, the states piggybacking the federal taxation to tax this. It all ends. It all ends under Moore. It can't be sustained in a court anymore under Moore. So, and is this, let's take a look at what the Supreme Court said in 1937. We know what they said in 1916. We know what they said in 2024. Let's look at what the court was saying just previous to the World War II. This is from Stewart Machine Company v. Collector, 301 U.S. 548 in 1937. The tax, and they're talking here about a corporate income tax in this particular case. The tax being an excise, its imposition must conform to the canon of uniformity. There has been no departure from this requirement. According to settled doctrine, the uniformity exacted is geographical, not intrinsic. And it cites Knowlton v. Moore, Flint v. Stone Tracy, Billings v. U.S., Stellwagen v. Klum, LaBelle Iron Works, Poe v. Seaburn, Wright v. Vinton, and this is all from, as I said, Stewart Machine. But what else? The court goes on. Whether the tax is to be classified as an excise is in truth not of critical importance. If not that, it is an impost or a duty. A capitation or other direct tax, it certainly is not. So we see that the Supreme Court was consistent in 1913, 1937, and 2024 in declaring the income tax as of the form of indirect taxation under Article 1, Section 8, not a direct tax, not imposed on the citizens, not imposed outside of the impost, duty, and excise authorities to tax certain activities and transactions, but not the labor of the American people conducted in the 50 states, nor to tax any of the earnings of the American people associated with their property or the increase of it, outside of any impost, duty, or excise activity or transaction. That means basically they can tax the gambling at the casinos, and that's about it. Don't hold me on that. Okay, so you got a complete and total constitutional fraud that's been perpetrated on the American people since 1942 in the victory tax, which was exacerbated by the Glenshaw glass holding in 1955, which, like Roe v. Wade, affirmative action, Chevron, was bad law from a liberal court misapplying the second plank of the Communist Manifesto as Section 61 instead of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. It's not a tax on all accessions to wealth. Congress never had any authority to do that based on sources. That's nonsense. That makes everyone a federal slave. You grant that power. What happens if they raise the tax to 100%? You do anything about it then? Once you give them one, you've lost the ball game. And that's why the Founding Fathers prohibited the even one. Nothing. They're entitled to nothing. And the graduated indirect taxation of citizens is also unconstitutional because it's not uniform. It's geographical uniformity can't be applied within the states to create different classes of citizens, poor, middle class, and wealthy, upper class, lower class, middle class, who all get taxed at different rates. You couldn't do that based on religion, or age, or gender, or sexual preference, or national origin, or color. And you can't do it based on wealth either. It's all a fraud, based on the fraudulent, unconstitutional claim that the 16th Amendment created a new power to tax everything Americans do in the 50 states without any limitation being applied to the direct power. It's all a fraud. All a fraud, 100%. And it's all got to die under Moore for all of the reasons I'm laying out in this show. Having gross income under Section 61 is not a valid legal basis to tax by impost, duty, or excise. Having a list of sources doesn't qualify as taxable foreign activity by impost, or taxable export activity by duty, or taxable commodities, licenses, or corporate activity by excise. It isn't there. Once you're limited to 181, the power to tax in the 50 states disappears, just as it was intended to never exist by the Founding Fathers. Never intended to exist. And this U.S. tax court denies the American people unconstitutionally their right to a trial by jury as well. You get no trial by jury. It's just a rubber stamp from the court. Well, you wouldn't get a single conviction in the tax court if a jury was allowed to review the claims. But no, you can't have a jury. What do you mean? It's for hundreds of thousands of dollars. No jury. It says $20, I get a jury. It doesn't say except for tax claims. It doesn't say except when the government wants the money. There's no separation in law between equity and other claims. It's all civil court, trial by jury. Congress can't create a law that says we're going to take thousands of dollars from you without juries reviewing the matter. That's utter nonsense. That's communism. That's the rubber stamp of the tyrant. We say you owe. Why? We say so. The law doesn't support it, but we say so. Nonsense. The whole system's been unconstitutional since World War II. And what, you think the court made any other errors in World War II? You mean like Korematsu, where they locked up and interred all the Japanese people without due process, basis, suspicion, evidence, or testimony? Just on discrimination by national origin? Yeah, it's one of the worst decisions in the history of the country, right up there with Dred Scott. And this is the same court that gave you Glenshaw Glass, jamming communist tyranny down your throat to fund the expansion of government into areas they don't belong, like education, energy, agriculture, transportation, commerce, labor, housing, environment, occupational safety. None of these things are authorized. None of them should exist. This is where the bureaucracy that's unconstitutionally ruling America by regulation has evolved out of. And the income tax is the heart of it. And Chevron was the weapon. that let them write their own law to enslave you. It's gone, and without Chevron, liability for tax fails, and substitute for returns fail. Every single substitute for return is based on a regulatory claim that they can substitute a certification that a tax return was done instead of actually producing the tax return required by statute under IRC 6020B, which has to be signed under 6020B2 in order to be prima facie good and sufficient for all legal purposes, i.e., as evidence in court of an enforceable assessment. Where's the tax return? There isn't one. They've admitted they don't produce them. They just defraud the computer with a fraudulent transaction entry telling it that a substitute for return document has been prepared. But there is no document. They just defraud the computer. And then in court, they refuse to produce a return because it doesn't exist. Instead, they produce a certification that some agent has seen it. And that's a friggin' lie, because it doesn't exist. And the regulation that lets them substitute the certification for the actual tax return form is now dead under Loper-Bright. You have to look to the statute, which says nothing about certification. It says produce the subscribed tax return, which has to be signed and sworn to under penalty of perjury, just like all other tax returns that you prepare and sign. That requirement is laid on the IRS. So why won't they do a tax return? It's because Form 1040 isn't authorized to be used under Section 6020. That's not one of the returns they're authorized to use in the substitute for return program. So they don't actually create one. They just tell the computer one has been done. The reason why they tell the computer one has been done is because everything is automated and the computer won't examine anything except a tax return. So they lie about a tax return. They kick that zero return, the frivolous return that they create, over to examination, who then tacks on the W-2s, 1099s, and other statements, which should have gone on the return. But then they went ahead to produce it so people could see how the number was calculated. So they just put zero on and nobody asked to see it. And instead they produced the 4549 with all the entries that should have gone on the return put onto a 4549 and claim they don't have to produce the return because the regulations allow the substitution of evidence. But the statutes don't allow it. So this regulatory substitution to try and keep non-filers in line is gone. They've openly admitted to Congress, we have the letter, that they don't produce physical returns. Now, if you don't produce a physical return, there's no way to subscribe it as required under 6020B2 in order to make it prima facie good and sufficient legal evidence in court. Prima facie good and sufficient for all legal purposes. It doesn't exist. It's all fraud by computer fraud. They're defrauding their own computer system in order to get it to enforce tax against non-filers. Because the law doesn't impose a tax on you, and it actually records that, and so too does the computer system. It has to have a return. That's also required under 6201. No return, no assessment. No assessment, no deficiency. It's all fraud. And it's all being done unconstitutionally for the last 70 years as a direct non-apportioned tax. And the Supreme Court has killed that. All you need to do is start arguing it. So get over to taxfreedom.com and start reading, and get over to irszoom.com and give me a call so that I can get you the documents that you need to defeat and oppose the IRS. Everybody in the country should be waking up to this. April 15th is coming. This should be the last year anybody pays. Claim exempt. Get your refund and stop filing under Moore. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We'll be back next week with more on Moore.